Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when the world you knew was coming apart at the seams. Imagine the streetlights of your city flickering out, one by one, with no one left who remembers how to fix them. Imagine the superhighways crumbling, the internet archives blinking into nothingness, and the grand, solid structures of civilization slowly being reclaimed by weeds and silence. This is the world after the fall of Rome, the supposed dawn of the Dark Ages. A cheeky reality check for you. If you were transported there with all your modern knowledge, you probably wouldn't survive the first winter, let alone the local warlord who finds your dental fillings fascinating. The comforts we take for granted were luxuries built on a system, and that system was crashing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a small click for you, but it's the signal that keeps this little beacon of strange histories lit. In the comments, I'd love to see where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always a quiet thrill to see this community spanning the globe connected in the dead of night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes. Feel the cold stone beneath you. It's not the smooth, polished marble of a senator's villa, but the damp, uneven floor of a half-ruined basilica you've taken shelter in. The year is somewhere in the late 5th century, maybe 480 AD, maybe 490. It doesn't really matter. The calendar itself feels like a relic of a more organized time. What matters is the biting wind whistling through a crack in the wall where a mosaic of some forgotten god has crumbled away. What matters is the gnawing in your belly. The last shipment of grain from Africa? That was your grandfather's time. Now, you eat what you can find. You are a citizen of what was once the greatest empire the world had ever known. But the word citizen is a bitter joke. It implies rights, protections, a shared identity. What you have is a region, a local strongman, and a pervasive sense of loss. You walk along the Via Appia, or what's left of it, the masterfully cut paving stones, once humming with the traffic of legions and merchants, are now tilted and broken, forced apart by stubborn weeds. A family of refugees, their faces smudged with dirt and despair, huddle around a pathetic fire they've built in the middle of this once great artery. They're burning the wooden signpost for a nearby town, not out of malice, but for a few precious moments of warmth. The words, once crisp and clear, curl into black ash. The direction is lost. The destination itself may no longer exist. This is the reality of the fall. Mainstream history often gives us a neat, tidy date, 476 AD. The year the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was unceremoniously deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But you, sitting here on this cold floor, no, it wasn't a single event. It wasn't a switch being flipped. It was a long, agonizing dimming of the lights. It was 1,000 unrepaired bridges, a million untended fields, a generation of children who were never taught to read. The fall was the empire dying of 1,000 cuts of systemic neglect. The heart had stopped beating long ago. The limbs were just now beginning to grow cold. You remember stories from your elders about how things used to be. The aqueducts, those magnificent stone serpents that coiled across the landscape, bringing fresh, clean water into the heart of every major city. You look out from your shelter now and see one in the distance, a line of silent, skeletal arches against the bruised twilight sky. But it's dry. A section of it collapsed a decade ago, and nobody possessed the engineering knowledge, the manpower, or the political will to organize its repair. So the great bathhouses, centers of Roman social life, are now squalid, moss-choked ruins. People drink from the river, the same river they dumped their waste into, and wonder why the gods have cursed them with endless sickness. They've forgotten the principles of sanitation, not because they were stupid, but because the infrastructure that made it possible has vanished. The loss of knowledge is everywhere, and it's not yet a conspiracy. It's just entropy. It's rot. In the ruins of a wealthy merchant's villa, you find what was once a library. But the scrolls are not pristine. The damp has crept in, turning the papyrus to a dark, flaky mush. Termites have feasted on the histories of Livy and the poetry of Catullus. A desperate scavenger might have used a bundle of irreplaceable texts for kindling last winter. Who can blame them? A dry, philosophical argument about the nature of the soul is cold comfort when you're freezing to death. This is how a world's memory begins to fade, not in a blaze of glory, but in a million quiet, desperate acts of survival. The grand, centralized state that had funded the libraries, paid the scholars, and administered the schools was gone, and in its place, a gaping void. Into this void steps a new kind of power. It's a power that has been growing for centuries, often in the shadow of the empire, sometimes in defiance of it. It's the Catholic Church. As the secular world of governors and prefects dissolves, the ecclesiastical world of bishops and priests remains. Their hierarchy is intact. Their communication network, though strained, still functions. A letter from a bishop in Gaul to a bishop in Hispania might still get through, carried by a brave monk on a donkey, while a message between the new barbarian kings of those regions would be unthinkable. You see it in your own town. The Roman magistrate fled years ago. The basilica, the court of law, is a shell. But the bishop is still here. His church, though meager compared to the old temples, is the new center of the community. He is the one people turn to when there is a dispute over land. He is the one who organizes a meager dole for the starving. He is the one who represents order in a world descending into chaos. And most critically, he is the one who has the scribes. You venture cautiously toward the local monastery. It's a fortified compound now. Its high stone walls as much for protection from raiders as for spiritual seclusion. Inside, the contrast with the world outside is staggering. Here, there is quiet, there is routine, there is purpose. You hear the rhythmic cadence of Gregorian chant, a sound that imposes a mathematical, divine order on the unruly air. You see the structured, disciplined life of the monks, governed by the ringing of bells, a life of prayer, labor, and, most importantly, copying in a cold, drafty room known as a scriptorium. You see them. A handful of men, their heads bowed in concentration, their world shrunk to the tip of a quill and the expanse of a prepared animal skin, a vellum page. They are the guardians of the written word. In a world where literacy is plummeting faster than a thrown stone, these men are the last flickering flame of knowledge. They are the new librarians. They are the new archivists of Western civilization. And it is here, in this quiet, holy room, that the story of the next 1,000 years is decided. Because they aren't saving everything. They can't. Parchment is expensive. Making ink is a laborious process involving oak galls, iron salts, and gum Arabic. A single book could require the skins of an entire flock of sheep and a scribe's entire year. Resources are painfully scarce, so a choice must be made. A triage. What is essential to save? What knowledge is most vital for the survival of humanity? For these men, the answer is obvious. The Bible is paramount. Commentaries on the scriptures by the church fathers, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, are next. Theological arguments, the lives of the saints, liturgical texts for performing the Mass. This is the knowledge that pertains to the soul, to salvation, to the eternal. This is God's truth. Everything else? Well, that's a different story. Historians still argue whether the Church's initial preservation efforts were a conscious act of curating a specific future worldview, or simply a pragmatic triage born of limited resources and a devout focus on the sacred over the secular. Was it a deliberate choice to let the pagan poets die, or did they simply not have enough sheepskin to save both St. Paul's epistles and Ovid's cheeky guide to seduction? The art of love. Faced with that choice, a pious 6th century monk wouldn't even see it as a choice. He would see one essential text and one piece of dangerous, worldly fluff. The decision was preordained by his entire belief system. This wasn't the first time the world's knowledge had faced such a bottleneck. Think of the Great Library of Alexandria, a name that has become synonymous with the loss of ancient wisdom. We imagine a single catastrophic fire, a cinematic tragedy of epic proportions. But the truth, much like the fall of Rome, was a slower, sadder affair. The library suffered from multiple fires over centuries, yes, but it also suffered from budget cuts when the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty dried up. It suffered from purges, where scholars of one political or philosophical faction would be expelled by a new ruler, their works falling into neglect. It suffered from a changing culture that grew less interested in Greek empirical science and more interested in mystical revelation. The final destruction of its last remnants, the Serapeum, in 391 AD by a Christian mob at the behest of the Patriarch Theophilus, was just the final blow to a body long wasting away. The precedent was clear. Knowledge is fragile. It is not a monument of stone, but a delicate ecosystem. It requires constant tending, funding, and a culture that values it. When any of those fail, the ecosystem collapses. Now, back in your chilly scriptorium, you see this process happening in microcosm. The monk beside you is working on a palimpsest. This is a frugal and telling practice. He has taken an old book, a book he has deemed non-essential. With milk and oat bran, he has painstakingly scrubbed and scraped the ink from the precious parchment, erasing the words of a long-dead author to create a blank slate for a new, more worthy text. Perhaps what he is erasing is a Roman engineering manual, full of complex calculations for making waterproof concrete or constructing hypocaust systems for central heating. Knowledge that would be incredibly useful in this cold, crumbling monastery. But to him, it's just a collection of pagan formulas. He is overriding it with a copy of the Psalms. He is literally writing his religion over the top of a past science. This practice gives us one of our most fascinating glimpses into lost worlds. Modern multispectral imaging can sometimes see through the top layer of ink to the ghost text underneath. The famous Archimedes palimpsest is a prime example. In the 1990s, scholars discovered that a 13th century Byzantine prayer book was, in fact, a palimpsest. Underneath the prayers, they found unique works by the great mathematician Archimedes. including the method of mechanical theorems and Stomachian texts that exist nowhere else. For 700 years, one of the greatest minds of antiquity was hidden beneath a book of religious rites. It's a perfect, almost painfully literal metaphor for the age. It wasn't always malicious destruction. Sometimes it was just recycling. One monk, needing parchment for a new hymnal, might grumble about the uselessness of this old text by Zeno on Stoic philosophy. After all, what did Zeno know of the resurrection? Scrape, scrape, scrape. So you begin to see the shape of the new world. It's not just that old knowledge is being lost to rot and ruin. It's that what is being saved is passing through an incredibly specific ideological filter. The knowledge being preserved is that which supports the Christian worldview. A treatise on agriculture by Columella might survive because monasteries needed to farm efficiently. But a work of Epicurean philosophy, arguing that the gods do not intervene in human affairs and that the soul is mortal, that's not just useless, it's dangerous. It's heresy. Leaving such a text around would be like leaving a loaded weapon in a nursery. Better to scrub it clean or use it to light the scriptorium fire. It would be a funny thought, if it weren't so tragic, to imagine how many drafty medieval castles could have benefited from Roman underfloor heating. But the manual was likely used to wrap cheese centuries earlier because it lacked a proper theological framework. The very definition of knowledge is changing. For the Greco-Roman world, knowledge was diverse, practical, how to build an aqueduct, scientific, how to chart the stars, philosophical, what is the good life, and artistic, how to write a perfect line of poetry. For the emerging medieval mind, all true knowledge had to serve a single, unified purpose, to illuminate the nature of God and the path to eternal salvation. It was a grand, unifying theory of everything, and anything that didn't fit was, by definition, not worth knowing. You pull your thin cloak tighter around you. The chanting from the chapel has begun again, a sound that is at once comforting in its stability and terrifying in its monolithic power. The world outside is a chaotic landscape of competing warlords, but inside these scattered, fortified islands of faith, a new, unified world is being edited into existence. The great, messy, contradictory library of the ancient world is being curated. Its shelves are being cleared. Certain volumes are being lovingly copied and recopied, their status elevated to Holy Writ. Others are being quietly, piously, methodically erased from history. The air grows colder. The light from the single tallow candle sputters. You understand now that the Dark Ages isn't about a sudden absence of light. It's about the management of light. It's about who gets to hold the candle, who gets to decide which scrolls are read by its precious flame, and which are used to fuel it. The fire of classical knowledge hasn't been extinguished entirely. Not yet. It has been brought indoors into a single, heavily guarded building, where a new set of librarians are deciding which pages are worth saving. The rest of the world is left outside, in the growing dark, waiting for a story. And that story, you realize with a shiver, will be the one the librarians choose to tell. The story is being chosen. Yes, but a story needs a language. And this is where the control becomes something more than just selective preservation. It becomes an act of deliberate construction, a redrawing of the world's intellectual map. You are standing on one side of a new, invisible wall. On your side, the world speaks in 100 different dialects. The language of the farm, the market, the tavern. It's the tongue of your mother, the language you used to love and to grieve. It's what linguists would later call vulgar Latin, the living, breathing, evolving speech of the common people, slowly morphing into the languages we'd one day recognize as Italian, Spanish, French. It's messy, practical, and alive. But on the other side of that wall, inside the scriptorium, inside the bishop's chancellery, inside the mind of the new ruling class, another language is being used. It's Latin. Yes, but a very specific kind of Latin. It's not the fluid, poetic language of Virgil or the sharp, rhetorical Latin of Cicero. It's a formalized, rigid, ecclesiastical Latin. It's a language of scholarship and liturgy, codified and maintained as a separate, elevated tongue. It became a tool not just for communication, but for exclusion. Imagine today if every law, every government policy, every scientific paper, and every news report was published exclusively in a highly technical form of academic language that only people with a PhD in that specific field could decipher. That is the world you now inhabit. The local lord might issue a decree, but it's written down by a clerk in a language the Lord himself can barely understand. A deed to your small plot of land, your only claim to existence, is a piece of parchment covered in symbols that are meaningless to you. You have to trust the priest, trust the clerk, trust the man who holds the keys to the language of power. You are linguistically disenfranchised. Your ability to engage with the concepts of law, history, and formal theology has been outsourced to a tiny, clerical elite. This divide was solidified in a very concrete way. The great Emperor Charlemagne, around the year 800, launched what is now called the Carolingian Renaissance. On the surface, it was a noble project. He was horrified by the declining standards of literacy and the variations in Latin that were causing confusion in both religious texts and administrative documents. He gathered scholars from all over Europe, like the great Alcuin of York, to standardize Latin, to reform the handwriting into a clear, new script, Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of our own lowercase letters, and to ensure that the copies of the Bible were accurate. This is a mainstream historical fact, often lauded as a bright spot in a dark century. But look at the unintended consequence. This act of standardization, meant to preserve knowledge, also embalmed it. It froze Latin, making it a subject of formal study, separating it definitively from the living languages of the people. It cemented its status as a code, a secret handshake for the educated and the powerful. To speak the vernacular was to be common. To read and write in the correct Latin was to have access to the mind of God and the machinery of the state. But knowing the language isn't enough. You can be the most brilliant Latinist in the world, but your thoughts are just vapor if you can't write them down. And this brings us to the second layer of control, the monopoly on the means of production. You couldn't just pop down to the local papyrus mart for supplies. The era of cheap and plentiful papyrus from Egypt was over. The new medium was parchment, and its more refined cousin, vellum. And you, the listener, cannot fathom how much work that entails. Picture the process. You don't start with a tree. You start with an animal, a sheep, a calf, a goat. The animal is slaughtered, the skin carefully removed, You soak it in a lime solution for days to loosen the hair and fat. Then comes the disgusting, back-breaking work of scraping it clean with a curved knife. Then you stretch it tight as a drumhead on a wooden frame, and you scrape it again with a special rounded blade called a linellum, thinning it, evening its texture, creating a smooth, pale surface. You let it dry under tension for days, adjusting it constantly so it doesn't warp or tear. A single large book, like a Bible, could require the skins of over 200 calves. An entire herd, sacrificed for one volume. This wasn't a casual hobby. This was a specialized, resource-intensive industry, and the monasteries became the masters of it. They had the land for the flocks, the manpower in the form of lay brothers, and the institutional knowledge passed down from one generation of monks to the next. Then there's the ink. No ballpoint pens, no ink cartridges. You had to make it yourself. The most common recipe was for iron gall ink. You take oak galls, those strange, round growths on oak trees caused by wasp larvae, and you crush them. You soak them in water, or sometimes wine or vinegar, to release the tannic acid. Then, in a separate container, you dissolve iron salts, often called copperas or vitriol, in water. When you mix the two solutions, a chemical reaction occurs, producing a deep, purplish black liquid. You add a binder, like gum arabic, to keep the pigment suspended and help it flow from the quill. It was chemistry, it was technology, and the recipes were often closely guarded secrets. So, if you're a brilliant, independent thinker living in, say, 9th century Francia, and you have a revolutionary idea that challenges church doctrine, how do you spread it? You can't just write a blog post. You can't self-publish. You need parchment and you need ink. Who has it? The very institution you wish to critique. It's like trying to protest a tech monopoly when that monopoly owns the internet, the computers, the power grid, and the alphabet. You might try to jot down your heretical thoughts on a piece of tree bark with some berry juice, but your brilliant treatise is more likely to be eaten by a passing deer than to spark a revolution. The gatekeepers of knowledge weren't just guarding the library. They owned the paper mill and the pen factory, too. With this absolute control over the language and the materials, the stage is set for the most audacious act of all, not just selecting history, but actively rewriting it. Settle back into the scriptorium. The monk is no longer just making a pragmatic choice between a sacred and a secular text. He is now an editor, a moral censor. He has before him an old chronicle, perhaps from the time of the Goths, which details the reign of a certain king. This king was an Arian, a believer in a form of Christianity deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. But the chronicle, written by one of his own people, praises his justice, his military skill, his piety. To the monk, this is not just a historical inaccuracy. It is a spiritual poison. It is a lie that could lead souls astray. So he takes up his scraper. He doesn't destroy the whole text. He just improves it. He carefully scrapes away the passage praising the king's Arian faith. In its place, he writes of the king's secret torment, his inner knowledge that his faith was false. He adds a small story, entirely of his own invention, about how the king's greatest military victory was followed by a plague that struck his firstborn son, a clear sign of God's displeasure. He is not, in his own mind, lying. He is revealing a deeper truth. the moral truth that God's universe is just and that heresy is always punished. He is correcting the historical record to align it with divine reality. Multiply this small, pious act by thousands of scribes across hundreds of monasteries over 500 years. The result is a history that has been systematically detoxified of any narrative that doesn't fit the approved worldview. This brings us to the masterful art of hagiography, the writing of the lives of the saints. These were the bestsellers of the Middle Ages, the blockbusters, the superhero stories. But they were not biographies in our modern sense. They were tools of instruction, designed to inspire awe and enforce orthodoxy. Did the local saint really slay a dragon? Probably not. The story is more likely a Christianized version of an older pagan myth about a hero vanquishing a local monster. The dragon is a symbol of paganism, the saint a symbol of Christ's power. Did Saint Genevieve really save Paris from Attila the Hun through prayer alone? What matters is not the verifiable fact, but the lesson. Faith is a shield stronger than any wall. These stories also served a practical purpose. Historians still argue whether the widespread Christianizing of pagan sites and stories was a deliberate strategy of cultural conquest or a more organic process of syncretism, where new beliefs simply grafted themselves onto the rootstock of ancient traditions. It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the church say, that sacred spring is popular, let's assign a saint to it to steal its power? Or did the local people, converting to Christianity, simply continue their ancient water worship but redirect their prayers to a new, sanctioned figure? Either way, the result was the same. The past was absorbed, rebranded, and redeployed under new management. Sometimes, the fabrication was far more audacious and political. Let me tell you about one of the most successful and significant forgeries in human history, the donation of Constantine. This quirky and world-changing tidbit is a document that appeared in the 8th century. It was purported to be a legal decree from the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, written back in the 4th century. In this text, a grateful Constantine, supposedly cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, grants the Pope and his successors temporal, worldly authority over the city of Rome, all of Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire. He essentially hands the keys to the kingdom to the papacy. For the next 700 years, this document was the cornerstone of the papacy's claims to political power. It was cited in disputes with kings and emperors. It justified the existence of the Papal States, a territory in central Italy ruled directly by the Pope. It was, quite literally, the legal foundation for the Pope being not just a spiritual leader, but an earthly king. And it was a complete, total, 100% fake. It wasn't definitively proven to be a forgery until the 15th century, during the Renaissance. A humanist scholar named Lorenzo Valla, a master of the new science of philology, analyzed the Latin in the document and showed, conclusively, that it could not have been written in the 4th century. The vocabulary, the grammatical structures, the style, it was all characteristic of the 8th century, not the 4th. He was like a modern art expert proving a lost Rembrandt was fake because the artist used an acrylic paint that wasn't invented until 1950. The donation of Constantine is the ultimate proof of concept. With a monopoly on the archives and a mastery of the official language, you could literally invent the documents that gave you the world. This system of control trickles all the way down to the very concept of education. Imagine you are a young boy, perhaps a nobleman's second son, given to the church to be educated. You enter a monastic school. What is your curriculum? You learn your letters not by reading fun stories, but by copying the Psalms. Your history textbook is a chronicle that has been carefully edited to show God's hand in every event. Your science textbook is the Bible and commentaries on it, explaining that the universe is a divine creation centered on humanity. Your ethics textbook is the lives of the saints. You are not taught to question, to debate, to engage in Socratic dialogue. You are taught to receive, to memorize, to believe. The system is not designed to produce independent thinkers. It is designed to produce loyal and effective administrators of the system itself. It's a bit like being in a school where the answer to every question, from physics to history, is because the principal said so. And after a while, you stop asking why the principal might be right and simply accept his word as the definition of truth. After all, he's the only one who writes the textbooks. For you, the common person listening to this story, the effect is total. You can't read the books. You can't understand the language they're written in. Your entire sense of history, of the world beyond your village, of morality itself, is delivered to you in carefully packaged forms. The Sunday sermon, where the priest interprets a small piece of scripture for you. The morality plays performed in the town square on feast days. And the stained glass windows of the church. A vibrant, silent comic book showing Adam and Eve, the flood, and the crucifixion. It's a powerful, all-encompassing media ecosystem. Every story you hear, from every trusted source, reinforces the same central message. It would be foolish and arrogant to doubt it. Doubting would be like looking at a great cathedral and insisting you, a simple peasant, knew more about architecture than the master masons who built it. The official story of your local baron's great-grandfather, for instance, is that he was a pious man who converted to Christianity after a holy hermit showed him a vision. The less told story, the one whispered after too much ale, might involve a visit from a bishop accompanied by 100 armed men who made the baron an offer he couldn't refuse. But that version never makes it into the official chronicle. History is written by the winners. Yes, but more than that, it is written by the writers. And so you stand in this world of controlled language and curated truth. A reality has been constructed around you, written in a language you don't know, on materials you can't possess, based on a history that has been edited for your own moral improvement. The intellectual life of Europe has been funneled through the narrowest of gateways, guarded by men who believe, with absolute sincerity, that they are protecting humanity from dangerous and damnable error. They have created a closed loop, an information bubble that is almost impossible to pierce. The truth is no longer a thing to be discovered, but a thing to be received. This is a profound shift in human consciousness, and it begs a terrifying question. If you have the power to edit, rewrite, and forge the past with such success, what's to stop you from going one step further? What's to stop you from fabricating not just a document, but a decade or a century? What if the timeline itself is just another text, waiting for a pious and powerful editor to improve it? That question hangs in the cold air of the scriptorium, a question so monstrous it almost feels blasphemous to think it. If you can forge a deed, why not a decade? If you can invent a saint, why not a century? You pull the idea closer, treating it like a strange, glowing object you found in the dark. It feels impossible, ludicrous. History is a river. It flows. You can't just dam it up and insert a massive, artificial lake in the middle. continue, someone would notice. Or would they? Let's drift away from the smoky candlelight of the 9th century and float forward into our own time, to a modern library. You're pulling a book from a dusty shelf. It's written by a German historian and publisher named Heribert Illig. The title is unassuming, but the idea within is an intellectual firebomb. It's called the phantom time hypothesis, and it proposes something that shatters the very foundation of our historical record. The core claim is this: the 297 years between 614 AD and 911 AD are a complete fabrication. They never happened. They are a ghost, a phantom, inserted into our timeline through a coordinated, high-level conspiracy. Our calendar, Illig says, has been lying to us for over 1,000 years. We think we're living in the 21st century, but if he's right, we're actually somewhere in the 18th. The year is not 2025, it's 1728. Take a moment to let that sink in. It's not just a historical debate, it's a temporal earthquake. It suggests that nearly 3 centuries of what we call the early Middle Ages, the entire era of the Merovingian kings' decline, the rise of the Carolingians, the heights of Charlemagne's empire, the initial Viking raids on Britain, are nothing more than a story, a literary invention. It's as if you discovered that your great-great-grandparents never existed, that they were just characters your family made up, and there's a 70-year gap in your ancestry. You wouldn't know where your own story truly began. Now, whenever you encounter a conspiracy theory this grand, the first question you must ask is, why? What possible motive could anyone have for orchestrating such a monumental, continent-spanning lie? According to Illig and his supporters, the answer lies in the ambition of one man and the numerological obsession of an entire age. The chief architect, he claims, was the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, who ascended to the throne in the year we call 996 AD. At his side was his tutor and close confidant, a man named Gerbert of Aurillac, who would soon become Pope Sylvester II. Otto III was a man possessed by a powerful idea, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. He saw himself as a new Constantine, a ruler uniting Christendom under his singular, holy authority, and he wanted to be ruling at a very specific, very special time, the year 1000 AD. In the Christian world of the time, the year 1000 was not just a nice round number. It was freighted with immense eschatological weight. It marked a full millennium since the approximate birth of Christ. Many believed it could herald the apocalypse, the second coming, the final judgment. To be the emperor presiding over this momentous, biblically charged turning point would grant him a prestige and a divine mandate beyond measure. It's the ultimate political and religious branding opportunity. Here was the problem, at least according to the theory. As Otto and Gerbert looked at the calendar, the real date wasn't anywhere near 1000. It was closer to the year 700. They were 300 years too early for the big party. So, they hatched a plan of almost unbelievable audacity. If the calendar doesn't fit your ambition, you don't change your ambition. You change the calendar. They simply decreed that the year was now 996, and began filling the 300-year gap they had just created with fabricated history, drawing on legends, forging documents, and inventing rulers to populate the empty centuries. It's the most extreme example of faking it till you make it in human history. Otto III didn't just want to be on the cover of a hypothetical Man of the Millennium issue. He allegedly invented the millennium itself just to put his own face on it. This sounds insane. It sounds impossible. But Illig points to several pieces of evidence that, when viewed in a certain light, seem unnervingly compelling. First, there is the simple argument from silence. Proponents of the theory ask you to look closely at the phantom period from roughly 614 to 911. They claim it is a historical desert. Across Europe, there is a sudden, puzzling lack of archaeological evidence. Architectural styles seem to stagnate. Jewish history in Europe goes strangely quiet. There's a black hole in the history of Constantinople. It's as if Europe collectively took a 300-year nap. The argument is that this period is so devoid of progress and concrete findings because it never existed. The few stories we have from it are the forgeries created to fill the void. Then there is the figure of Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome on Christmas Day, 800 AD. Stands like a giant in the middle of this supposed phantom time. He is a figure almost too perfect, his reign too bright, his Carolingian Renaissance too sudden. He feels, the theory suggests, like a deliberate invention. He is the epic hero created to be the centerpiece of the forged history, a character so compelling and magnificent that no one would dare question the era he was written into. Mainstream historians, of course, have volumes of evidence for Charlemagne's existence, but even they still argue whether the Carolingian Renaissance was a true rebirth of classical learning or merely a limited, court-centric phenomenon that had little impact on the wider European population. The phantom time hypothesis just takes that doubt and dials it up to 11, suggesting he's less of a historical figure and more of a literary one. The most intriguing piece of evidence, however, is a technical one involving the calendar itself. This is where you have to do a little bit of sleepy math. We all know the Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, was not perfect. It miscalculated the length of the solar year by about 11 minutes and 14 seconds. This tiny error meant that the calendar year was slightly longer than the seasonal year, causing the dates to slowly drift. By the 16th century, the first day of spring was arriving on March 11th instead of March 21st. To fix this, Pope Gregory XIII introduced his Gregorian calendar reform in 1582. This is a solid, mainstream historical fact. To get the calendar back in sync with the seasons, he decreed that 10 days should be skipped. The day after October 4th, 1582, was October 15th, 1582. Here's the twist. Heribert Illig did the calculation. The Julian calendar was in use from its introduction in 45 BC until the reform in 1582 AD. That's a span of 1,627 years, with an error of about 1 day per 128 years. The accumulated drift should have been almost 13 days. 1627 divided by 128 is 12.7. So why did Pope Gregory only need to correct for 10 days? Where did the other 3 days of error go? Illig's explosive answer is that the error never accumulated for 3 centuries because those 3 centuries never happened. 300 years worth of drift, amounting to about 2.3 days, just isn't there in the calculations. Add that to the 10 days that were corrected, and you get much closer to the expected 13. To the theory's proponents, this isn't just a clue. It's mathematical proof, written in the sky, that our timeline is wrong. And what of Gerbert of Aurillac, the man who became Pope Sylvester II, the supposed technical director of this grand project? He is one of history's most fascinating and enigmatic figures. He was a polymath, a genius who traveled to Islamic Spain to study mathematics and astronomy. bringing back knowledge of the abacus and Arabic numerals to a largely enumerate Christian Europe. His knowledge was so vast and so alien that he was widely rumored to be a sorcerer who had traded his soul to the devil. A quirky tidbit that followed him for centuries was the legend that he had constructed a kaput locans, a talking bronze head, an automaton that could answer any yes or no question with the truth. Was he a sorcerer? Almost certainly not. But was he exactly the kind of brilliant, technically minded man, with knowledge far beyond his peers, who could master the astronomical and mathematical calculations needed to pull off a chronological forgery of this magnitude? The theory says yes. He was the perfect man for the job. Now, as you're sinking deeper into your pillow, a logical question begins to bubble up. Wait a second. This theory is incredibly Eurocentric. What about everyone else? The Islamic Golden Age was in full swing during this phantom period. The Tang dynasty in China was flourishing. The Byzantine Empire was right next door. Surely they would have noticed if Europe suddenly time traveled 300 years into the future? Their calendars and historical records don't show a massive gap. This is, for most mainstream historians, the argument that completely sinks the hypothesis. The conspiracy would have to be global to work. Illig and his supporters have answers, but they get complicated, requiring the conspiracy to grow larger and larger. Perhaps the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, who was a contemporary of Otto III and also a great compiler of histories, was in on the plot. Perhaps the Islamic and Jewish scholars, who used entirely different lunar and lunisolar calendars, were simply trying to correlate their histories with the flawed Christian timeline much later, and in doing so, propagated the error. It's like trying to cover up a simple lie. At first, it's one small falsehood, but then you have to invent 5 more lies to protect the first one, and 10 more to protect those 5. And soon, to make the whole story hang together, you have to claim your dog can speak Russian and works for a secret branch of the government. The cover-up becomes far more complex than the original crime. Imagine Pope Sylvester trying to coordinate this before the invention of email or telephones. He'd have to send a tired monk on a very long donkey ride to Baghdad with a coded message. Dear Caliph, FYI, we're jumping forward to the year 950. Please update your records. Hope all is well. Best, Sly. It stretches credulity to its breaking point. And yet, the core idea is seductive, isn't it? Even if you dismiss the phantom time hypothesis as a brilliant but flawed thought experiment, it does something important. It forces you to confront the fragility of history. It reminds you that our knowledge of the distant past is not carved in stone. It is a story pieced together from a long, fragile chain of documents that have been copied, translated, edited, and preserved by people with agendas, biases, and beliefs. It is a house built of paper cards, and the phantom time hypothesis simply walks up and asks, "Are you sure all the cards are there? Are you positive no one took a few out, or maybe added a few extra rows to make the house look taller?" So, let the theory dissolve. Let the centuries slide back into place. Let Charlemagne be real. The value of the journey wasn't in arriving at the destination of a fake timeline. It was in the unsettling realization that the timeline itself is a human construct, an act of trust. You trust that the scribe copying the chronicle was honest. You trust that the Pope's astronomers did their math right. You trust that the chain of knowledge has remained unbroken. The phantom time hypothesis is a whisper in the ear of history, saying, what if that trust is misplaced? Maybe inventing 300 years wholesale was too ambitious, too difficult to coordinate. Perhaps the deception didn't need to be so grand. After all, If you control the archives and the language, you don't necessarily need to invent vast, empty stretches of time. You just need to populate the time that's already there with the right people. People who serve your narrative, people who prove your power, people who perhaps never even existed at all. So, inventing 300 years of history might be a stretch. The logistics are a nightmare, the required conspiracy too vast to be believed. But you don't need a sledgehammer when a scalpel will do. Why invent an entire era when you can just populate the existing one with the right people? Why forge a timeline when you can forge a lineage? This is a much more subtle and perhaps more powerful form of control. Let's talk about the ultimate resume, the most important line of succession in the Western world, the papacy. At the very core of the Catholic Church's claim to authority is the doctrine of apostolic succession. It's the belief that the spiritual authority vested by Jesus in his chief apostle, St. Peter, has been passed down in a direct, continuous, and unbroken line from one pope to the next, all the way to the present day. This isn't just a quaint tradition. It's the theological bedrock of the Pope's role as the vicar of Christ on earth. The chain must be unbroken. An unbroken chain signifies a continuous divine mandate. A broken chain? That suggests the connection was severed, that the authority became merely human, a political office up for grabs. Now, put yourself back in the chaotic centuries after the fall of Rome. The world is fragmented. Communication is poor. Warlords and plagues are a constant threat. Rome itself is a shadow of its former glory, its population decimated, its great buildings crumbling. In this environment of violence and uncertainty, is it truly plausible that the transfer of power from one pope to the next was always clean, clear, and perfectly documented? What happens if a pope is assassinated and it takes 2 years of bloody street fighting between rival factions to install a new one? What happens if a plague wipes out half the clergy in Rome, along with the records of who was in charge? You, the listener, as a historical detective, would find these gaps in the record. An institution built on the idea of continuity cannot afford gaps. A gap is a sign of weakness. It's an invitation for challengers. So what do? If a link in your precious chain is missing, you don't admit it. You forge one. You create a pope on paper to fill the void in reality. It's not just about lying. It's about maintaining the sacred narrative. Let's look at that murky period we keep returning to, the so-called Dark Ages, from the 7th to the 10th centuries. If you try to verify the official list of popes from this era, you run into a curious problem. For many of them, the evidence is whisper thin. It's often circular. A pope is proven to have existed because his biography appears in a book called the Liber Pontificalis, or the Book of the Popes. This collection of papal biographies is one of our main sources for the early medieval papacy. But who wrote and compiled the Liber Pontificalis? For the most part, it was the papal administration itself. It's an internal document, an official history written by the institution about itself. For many popes on this list, there is no independent corroboration. No coins minted with their names. No diplomatic letters from foreign kings addressed to them. No inscriptions on refurbished churches crediting them. Men like Pope Donus, Pope Agatho, Pope Sicinius, Pope Valentine. Their existence hangs by the single thread of their inclusion in an official, internal document. It's like a company proving its founder was a genius by citing the company's own About Us page. The narrative is sealed in a closed loop. Imagine you are a papal archivist in the 11th century, tasked with compiling a definitive history of the papacy to bolster the current pope's authority in his struggles with the Holy Roman Emperor. You unroll the old scrolls, the scattered records, and you find a 20-year period in the 8th century where the records are a mess. There are mentions of rival claimants, periods of chaos, maybe even a long stretch where no one was definitively in charge. This won't do. It looks weak. It looks human. So you get to work. You take the name of a priest mentioned in a minor document. Let's call him Leo. You elevate him. You write a short, plausible biography. Pope Leo III, you write, was a pious man who reigned for 4 years. He rebuilt the roof of the Basilica of St. John Lateran and wrote a stern letter condemning the heresy of the goat worshippers in the hills. You invent a few details, assign him a reign, and slot him neatly into the gap. The awkward silence in the historical record is gone, replaced by the serene continuity of another Holy Father. The chain is strong again. Multiply this process over centuries of turbulence, and the official list begins to look less like a raw historical document and more like a carefully manicured garden, where all the weeds have been pulled. This isn't just wild speculation. History provides us with a period where the conditions were absolutely perfect for this kind of manipulation. I'm talking about a time known by the startlingly blunt name Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century, or the Obscure Age. This is a mainstream historical term for the period from roughly 904 to 964 AD. During this time, the papacy had fallen under the complete control of a powerful, corrupt, and ambitious Roman aristocratic family, the Theophylacti. The papal throne became their personal property, to be given to sons, lovers, and political allies. It was an era of incredible depravity and violence. Pope Sergius III allegedly had his 2 predecessors strangled and took a teenage mistress, Marozia, who was the daughter of the powerful matriarch Theodora. Marozia later had Sergius's own son with him, who she then managed to install as Pope John XI. Another pope from this era, John XII, was accused of turning the papal palace into a brothel and was supposedly killed by a jealous husband who caught the pope in bed with his wife. This is not anti-Catholic propaganda. This is the accepted history of one of the papacy's lowest points. Now, in a time of such profound corruption and instability, when popes were being installed and murdered with dizzying speed by a single powerful family, does it seem remotely plausible that the record-keeping was pristine and objective? Or does it seem like the perfect environment to manipulate the official record, to erase inconvenient popes, legitimize puppet popes, and generally rewrite history to suit the agenda of the family in charge? The fluidity of the papal list isn't just an ancient problem. It continues into the modern day, if you know where to look. The Vatican publishes an official yearbook called the Annuario Pontificio. It contains the definitive, authorized list of the popes. But what's fascinating is that this definitive list has changed. Popes have been added, removed, and reclassified. You see, history is messy. It's full of schisms and power struggles, and sometimes this resulted in more than one man claiming to be pope at the same time. The man on the official list is the pope. His rival is demoted by history to an antipope. But who gets which title is often a judgment made long after the fact by the winning faction. One of the most famous and entertaining examples of papal uncertainty is the legend of Pope Joan. It's a quirky, almost certainly fictional story, but its popularity tells you everything you need to know about the perceived vulnerability of the papal record. The legend, which was widely believed for centuries, tells of a brilliant English woman in the 9th century who disguised herself as a man, rose through the church hierarchy, and was eventually elected Pope John VIII. Her reign was successful for a couple of years, until her secret was spectacularly revealed when she unexpectedly gave birth during a papal procession through the streets of Rome. Historians now dismiss this as a fabrication, a wild piece of satire. But whether it was true or not, the fact that for hundreds of years, people believed it was possible, tells you that the idea of the official papal history being incomplete or fraudulent was not a fringe concept. For a real-world example of this roster shifting, we have the strange case of Pope not a Pope Stephen. In March of 752, a priest named Stephen was elected to be the next pope. However, just 3 days later, before he could be officially consecrated as a bishop, a requirement to be the Bishop of Rome, i.e., the Pope, he had a stroke and died. For over 1,000 years, he was on the list as Pope Stephen II. But in 1961, in a historical cleanup, the Vatican decided that since he was never consecrated, he didn't technically count. So they erased him from the Annuario Pontificio. It's like finding out one of the original Beatles was fired after 3 days, and all the album covers have been retroactively edited to remove him. This simple administrative change instantly created a numbering nightmare for all the popes named Stephen who came after him, a problem scholars still have to deal with. It's a stark reminder that the unbroken chain is not an immutable fact of history, but a curated list subject to review and revision by a committee. So, why does any of this matter? Because power is a story. The story the papacy tells is one of a divine mandate, passed in an unbroken line from the rock, Peter, upon whom Jesus would build his church. That story is its ultimate source of legitimacy. A clean, continuous list of popes is a powerful symbol of that story. It projects an image of serene stability, of divine guidance, of inevitability. It's the ultimate corporate origin story. Every great company has a polished About Us section on their website. It usually tells a story of a brilliant founder with a world-changing vision. It conveniently leaves out the messy details of the near bankruptcies, the bitter arguments between partners, and the products that failed spectacularly. The official list of popes is the most successful About Us page in the history of the world. Even the people doing the editing may not have seen it as a lie. Historians still argue whether the compilers of the Liber Pontificalis were engaged in deliberate deception or were simply acting as dutiful chroniclers, doing their best to reconstruct a chaotic past with limited and contradictory sources. From their perspective, they were serving a higher truth, the truth that the Church is divinely protected and its leadership continuous. If the earthly records were messy and didn't reflect this higher theological truth, then it was the records that needed to be corrected. One can almost picture a tired archivist in a Roman library, staring at a 15-year gap in the papal succession. "This is unseemly," he mutters, dipping his quill. It suggests chaos, when we know there is divine order. Let's see. We needed Pope John V, a short reign, known for his charity. Yes, that feels right. And with a few strokes of ink, order is restored. History is tidied up. The story is secure. The power, then, was not necessarily that every single pope was real. The power was that the story of their reality and their continuity was believed. That story became the foundation upon which cathedrals were built, kings were crowned, and a civilization was defined. But all these records, The chronicles, the papal lists, the forged donations are human documents. They are written on parchment, with ink, by men with agendas. They are, by their very nature, subjective. What if we could find a more objective record? A history book that cannot be forged, a clock that cannot be reset by emperors or popes. What if we could check humanity's homework against a celestial ledger? What happens to the official story when we look away from the dusty archives on Earth and turn our eyes to the heavens? Let's leave the dusty, musty scriptorium behind. Let's step outside into the cool night air. Look up. Above you, stretching from horizon to horizon, is the one history book that cannot be forged, the one chronicle that cannot be erased by a nervous monk with a scraper. It is the celestial clock, the moon, the planets, the distant stars. They move with a serene, mathematical precision, governed by the immutable laws of physics. Their dance is complex, but it is not random. It is a timepiece of unimaginable scale and accuracy. We can, with the powerful tools of modern astronomy and computer science, rewind this clock. We can point our virtual telescope at any spot on Earth, on any day in the last 6,000 years, and know with breathtaking certainty what the sky looked like. We can predict every solar eclipse, every lunar eclipse, every planetary conjunction, every passing of a famous comet. This makes ancient historical records that mention celestial events incredibly precious. They are like a pin dropped on a map of time. When a Babylonian clay tablet reports that the sun was blotted from the sky in the 3rd year of a king's reign, we can run the numbers. If we find that a total solar eclipse was indeed visible from Babylon on, say, April 15th, 136 BC, we have just anchored that king's reign to a specific, verifiable date. The sky becomes the ultimate fact-checker for the histories written by humans. This is where our journey takes another strange turn, because when you apply this celestial fact-checking to the chronicles of the early Middle Ages, that same murky period from the 7th to the 10th century, things start to get weird. The heavens and the histories begin to fall out of step. Imagine you are a modern researcher. You're reading a translation of a monastic chronicle from what we call 810 AD. The author, a diligent monk, writes with awe about a terrifying event. In this year, on the feast day of St. Martin, the sun was extinguished at the 9th hour, and the stars shone forth as if it were night. A clear description of a total solar eclipse. You have a date, a general location in Francia, and a description. You turn to your state-of-the-art software, powered by data from NASA and the world's greatest observatories. You input the information. You wait for the satisfying confirmation, but it never comes. The software shows that on November 11th, 810 AD, there was no total solar eclipse visible from anywhere in Charlemagne's empire. There was a minor partial eclipse visible from Scandinavia. But that's not what the monk described. You check a few years on either side. Nothing. You check the records of other cultures from the same time. No mention. You're left with a puzzle. Was the monk lying? Was he exaggerating a heavy cloud cover? Or, most disturbingly, was he a faithful observer, accurately describing a real event, but the date he wrote down, 810 AD, is simply wrong? If that date is wrong, what does that say about the entire chronological system his chronicle is a part of? This is not a single, isolated incident. Researchers who dive into this field report finding these discrepancies again and again. An eclipse described in one location happens, according to our calculations, a decade later and 1,000 miles away. A conjunction of planets that was meant to herald a royal birth is off by several years. Halley's Comet, that most famous and reliable of celestial visitors, appears in the historical record at times that are difficult to reconcile with its precisely calculated 76-year orbit. It's like reading your grandfather's diary, where he writes a beautiful, detailed entry about watching the Apollo 11 moon landing. The details are perfect. The emotion is real. But he dates the entry July 20th, 1967. You're faced with an uncomfortable choice. Was your grandfather a fibber, or was his calendar off by 2 full years? When you find dozens of such entries, you start to suspect it isn't just your grandfather. It's the calendar itself. This astronomical evidence is one of the pillars supporting radical theories like the phantom time hypothesis. The claim is that the timeline was artificially lengthened, and these astronomical ghosts are the proof. Events from an earlier time being copied into a later, fabricated century, where they no longer align with the real sky. The Church, the primary keeper of these records, had a deeply complicated and often contradictory relationship with the stars. It wasn't a case of simple, ignorant opposition. In fact, the Church needed sophisticated astronomy for its most important calculation, the date of Easter. This was the science of computus. The definition of Easter, the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox, is a puzzle that requires accurately tracking both the solar calendar for the equinox and the lunar calendar for the full moon. Monks like the Venerable Bede in 8th century England were masters of this sacred calculation. They created complex tables and calendrical devices to ensure the holiest day of the Christian year was celebrated at the correct time. This was sanctioned holy astronomy. It was the work of God, but there was a line thin as a razor's edge. Astronomy, the mathematical science of heavenly motion, was good. Astrology, the art of interpreting those motions to predict events on Earth, was, for the most part, a damnable heresy. It smacked of pagan fatalism. It suggested that a human's life was written in the stars, not determined by their own free will and God's grace. It also positioned the astrologer as a source of prophecy, a role the Church reserved for itself. So you were allowed to look up at the sky to calculate the calendar. But if you looked up and claimed to know from the position of Mars whether the king would win his next battle, you were treading on very dangerous ground. Of course, for most of human history, astronomy and astrology were two sides of the same coin. The great Ptolemy was both the Western world's master astronomer and master astrologer for 1,500 years. This created a deep institutional suspicion of anyone who seemed a little too interested in the stars for reasons other than the Easter calculation. Historians still argue whether the Church's suppression of astrological practices was driven more by a sincere theological opposition to determinism or by a pragmatic desire to be the sole purveyor of prophecy and divine knowledge. Was it about protecting souls or protecting a monopoly? This tension exploded centuries later with figures who have become martyrs for science. Think of Giordano Bruno, the Dominican friar who, in the late 16th century, gazed up at the stars and didn't just see points of light on a celestial sphere. He saw other suns. He proposed an infinite universe filled with countless worlds, perhaps even countless other living beings. This wasn't just a tweak to the existing model, it was a philosophical detonation. It shattered the cozy, human-centered universe that the Church had presided over for a millennium. If humanity was not the center of creation, if they were just one of infinite possibilities, the entire story of salvation was threatened. For these and other heresies, The Inquisition imprisoned him for 7 years, and when he refused to recant, they burned him at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori. And then there is Galileo Galilei. His story is often simplified, but the core of it remains a powerful example of this conflict. Using his newly improved telescope, he saw things that directly contradicted the official Earth-centered cosmology. He saw mountains on the moon, proving it was a physical place, not a perfect celestial orb. He saw 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything revolved around the Earth. He saw the phases of Venus, which was only possible if Venus orbited the Sun. The evidence was overwhelming, but he wasn't just disagreeing with a scientific theory. He was challenging the entire edifice of knowledge, built on the authority of Aristotle and the literal interpretation of Scripture. His punishment, house arrest for the rest of his life, was a clear message. Observational evidence would not be allowed to contradict revealed truth. It's like being grounded for proving, with photographic evidence, that the cherished family story about your ancestor being a king is false. The truth is not always welcome. Now, for a quirky and telling tidbit, the Vatican runs its own observatory. The Scuola Vaticana is one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world, now with a high-tech telescope in Arizona to escape the light pollution of Rome. Isn't that ironic? The institution that silenced Galileo is now a leader in astronomical research. Why? The official reason is to show the world the Church's harmony with true science. But a more cynical, conspiratorial mind might wonder if the Church has always known the sky holds dangerous secrets about our timeline. Perhaps they maintain the observatory not just to chart the heavens, but to be the first to know of any anomalies, to control the celestial narrative, to hold the keys to the clock that could prove their own history books wrong. Imagine the stress of that job in the 17th century. Your Holiness, my calculations for Easter are perfect for the next 500 years. But, please don't ask me what I saw last night when I pointed my telescope at Jupiter. You won't like it. So we are left with this swirling vortex of uncertainty. We have a celestial clock, precise and incorruptible. We have human chronicles from a chaotic period that seem to misread that clock. And we have an overarching authority that both needs the clock for its own rituals and fears the clock for the secrets it might tell. This is the perfect recipe for a manipulated timeline. By discouraging independent astronomy, by holding a monopoly on calendrical calculations, and by correcting the historical records that didn't align with their worldview, the Church could have effectively hidden any chronological discrepancies from the world for centuries. The celestial evidence, then, is not a smoking gun. It's a sky full of question marks. It whispers that our neat, linear timeline of history might be a human invention, superimposed on a cosmic reality that tells a different story. The stars are not lying. The question is whether the people interpreting them have been telling us the truth. If the sky above is filled with such doubt, what about the ground beneath our feet? If the timeline is distorted, could it have distorted our understanding of geography, too? What if there are maps from this era, or just after, that show a knowledge of the world that should have been impossible? Maps that seem to come from a different timeline altogether. The sky, it seems, holds its secrets close, offering only maddening hints of a timeline gone awry. So let's turn our gaze downward, from the celestial clock to the lines drawn on parchment. Let's look at the Earth itself, or at least, humanity's attempts to chart it. A map is a powerful thing. It's a snapshot of a culture's worldview. It's a declaration that says, this is our world. This is what we know. And this is where our knowledge ends. Drift with me into a typical monastic library in the heart of the European Middle Ages. You find the maps, the Mappa Mundi. They are beautiful, ornate, and, to your modern eyes, utterly useless for navigation. You're looking at what's known as a T&O map. It's a simple, elegant diagram. A circle, the O, represents the world ocean, the impassable boundary of creation. Inside that circle, a T shape forms the continents. The top half is Asia, the bottom left is Europe, the bottom right is Africa. The waters of the T are the Don, the Nile, and the Mediterranean. And at the very center of the world, the intersection of the T is Jerusalem. This is not a geographic document. It is a theological one. It's a diagram of God's plan, a visual representation of a world perfectly ordered around the holy city. The edges are filled with illustrations of monstrous races and terrifying beasts. A clear warning, here be dragons. This was the official world, the world that made sense within the curated library of Christian knowledge. It was small, known, and finite. Now, let's leave that quiet, orderly library and jump forward in time to Istanbul. In the year 1929, in the Grand Topkapi Palace, home of the former Ottoman sultans, a German theologian is cataloging the library's contents. He stumbles upon a fragment of a map, tucked away, forgotten. It's drawn on a piece of gazelle skin, dated with the Islamic year 919, which corresponds to 1513 AD. The cartographer's name is clearly written, Reis. This is where the calm, predictable world of the T&O maps shatters into a million pieces. Reis was a real historical figure, and this is a mainstream historical fact. He was a celebrated admiral in the Ottoman Navy, a contemporary of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, a man who had fought battles, explored the seas, and was known as a master cartographer. The map's authenticity is not in question. What is in question is what it depicts. The surviving fragment shows the Atlantic Ocean, the western coasts of Europe and Africa, and the eastern coast of South America. And the details are baffling. The coastline of South America is rendered with an accuracy that seems impossible for 1513, only 2 decades after Columbus's first voyage. The official story is that the early explorers were still making rough, tentative sketches of the New World. This map shows the coast in stunning detail, including the mouth of the Amazon River. But that's not the most shocking part. Settle in and listen closely. At the very bottom of the map, there is a landmass extending eastward from the southern tip of South America. For decades, this was assumed to be a distorted drawing of the South American coast, just bent eastward to fit on the parchment. But in the 1950s, a retired U.S. Air Force officer and amateur archaeologist named Captain Arlington H. Mallory was studying the map. He proposed a radical new interpretation. He claimed that this landmass was not a distorted South America. It was Antarctica. This, of course, is impossible on 2 fronts. First, the continent of Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, 3 centuries after this map was made. Second, and far more unsettling, the coastline depicted on the Reis map appears to be the coast of Antarctica without its ice cap. We're talking about the subglacial topography, the actual land hidden beneath a sheet of ice that is, in places, over a mile thick. Modern science only managed to map this subglacial continent using seismic echo sounding and radar technology in the mid-20th century. And when they did, They found that the coastline on the 16th century Piri-Reis map bore a striking resemblance to the modern, high-tech map of Queen Maud Land, the landmass hidden under the ice. This is a paradox that can make your head spin. You have a 16th century Turkish admiral drawing a map of a continent that wouldn't be seen by human eyes for another 300 years. And he's drawing it in a state it hasn't been in for at least 6,000 years, before the last ice age sealed it away. It's like finding a perfect, high-resolution satellite photo of your hometown tucked inside a copy of the Gutenberg Bible. It simply should not exist. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. So how could this be? Piri-Reis gives us a clue himself in the elegant script of the notes he wrote in the margins of his own map. He says, with scholarly humility, that he is not responsible for the original surveying. He is a compiler. He says he created this chart by referencing about 20 older source maps. Some were from his contemporaries, like Portuguese explorers, and, he claims, a map made by Christopher Columbus himself which he had acquired. But other sources, he says, were far more ancient. He specifically mentions using maps drawn in the time of Alexander the Great, from the 4th century BC. Here is the heart of the alternative theory. Piri-Reis was not a prophet. He was the inheritor of a lost legacy. The map he drew was a copy of a copy of a copy, passed down through generations from a time when someone, some long-forgotten civilization, had the technology and the ability to accurately map the entire globe, including a version of Antarctica that was free of ice. This ancient knowledge was preserved, perhaps in the great libraries of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example. After its slow decline and final destruction, maybe some of its scrolls were saved and transported to the new capital of the Roman Empire, Constantinople. The Imperial Library of Constantinople became the world's foremost repository of classical knowledge for 1,000 years, until it was sacked by Christian crusaders in 1204 and ultimately fell to the Ottomans in 1453. It's entirely plausible that ancient maps, survivors from a forgotten age, were housed there, later to be discovered by Ottoman scholars like Piri-Reis. Of course, the mainstream explanation is far more mundane. Historians still argue whether the landmass depicted on the Piri-Reis map is truly a pre-glacial Antarctica or simply a creative interpretation of the South American coastline, which was believed by some cartographers at the time to curve eastward into the unknown. They say the similarities are coincidence, a case of pareidolia, our brains seeing a familiar pattern where none exists. But what if it's not a coincidence? If Piri-Reis had one of these ancient source maps, were there others? Where did they go? This question leads us, inevitably, back to Rome, back to the Vatican. The Vatican Apostolic Library and the infamous Vatican Secret Archives. The name, Secret Archives, is a bit of a misnomer now. It's not top secret, just private. But the scale of it is almost incomprehensible. It is said to contain over 53 miles of shelving, 53 miles of history, stretching back over 12 centuries. It is, without question, the single most important and extensive collection of historical documents on the planet. The theory goes that the Vatican holds the world's largest collection of this very type of anomalous ancient map. That as the Church consolidated its power, it became a voracious collector of historical documents. Anything that survived the fall of Rome, anything looted during the Crusades from the great libraries of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, anything deemed too dangerous for public consumption, was sent back to Rome and locked away. A map showing an ice-free Antarctica, or a detailed chart of the Americas made 1,000 years before Columbus, would be the definition of a dangerous document. Why? Because it tells a different story of humanity. The church's narrative was linear, from creation and the Garden of Eden, to the coming of Christ, to a future judgment day. It was a simple, powerful, and finite story. A map that implies a human history stretching back tens of thousands of years, a history of cycles of ice ages and lost high civilizations, completely shatters that linear narrative. It suggests a past far deeper and more mysterious than the Bible allows. So you don't burn the map. That would be a sin against knowledge. You classify it. You file it away. You lock it in a vault where it can't disturb the faithful. It's a world away from where you might be listening now, maybe in Ho Chi Minh City, where the evening is settling in. The distance in space is vast, but the distance in historical narrative might be even vaster. The Vatican archives have 53 miles of shelves. That's plenty of room to misplace a few inconvenient charts of the world. So you have these tantalizing ghosts on parchment. The Piri Reis map, the Orontes Phineas map of 1531, which also appears to show Antarctica's rivers and coastlines free of ice. The Mercator map of 1569, which includes an accurate depiction of Antarctica at the pole. All these famous cartographers hinting that they were drawing upon sources of knowledge that were ancient even in their time. The mainstream view calls it guesswork and coincidence. The alternative view calls it evidence. Evidence of a forgotten chapter in human history, a chapter that was deliberately torn out, leaving only these few surviving pages. Evidence of a world that was mapped and known long before the so-called age of discovery. And this begs the next question. If remnants of their knowledge survived on maps, did any of their physical creations survive? If they had the science to chart the globe, did they also have the science to build remarkable things? Are there objects, pieces of technology, buried in the soil of Europe, dated to these dark centuries, that tell a story not of decline, but of a startlingly bright and sophisticated light? A map, however strange, is still just a representation of the world. It's an idea on a piece of skin. But what if that forgotten knowledge wasn't just theoretical? What if it was practical, physical, and tangible? What if a civilization capable of charting an ice-free Antarctica also left behind its tools, its machines, its engines? What happens when you dig into the soil of the so-called Dark Ages and find not just crude pottery and rusty nails, but gears that whisper of a forgotten science? Settle back and imagine you're no longer a reader in a library, but an archaeologist on your knees in the mud. The sun is warm on your back. You are at a dig site in rural England, excavating what was thought to be a simple Saxon settlement from the 8th century. The official history, the story you learned in university, tells you what to expect. The foundations of rough timber huts, shards of simple, unadorned pottery, perhaps a few iron spearheads, corroded and pitted with age. The material culture of a world that had forgotten the glories of Rome. Your trowel scrapes against something hard, not a stone. It has a regular, metallic shape. Carefully, you brush away the dirt of 1,200 years, and what you find makes no sense. It's a small, intricate piece of bronze. It has teeth, perfectly cut, arranged in a precise circle. It is, unmistakably, a gear. And it's not just one. As you widen the trench, you find several more of different sizes interlocked. They are part of a mechanism, a complex machine. But there were no complex machines in 8th century Saxon England. The story says they had forgotten how to make them. The artifact in your hand, cold and real, is an anomaly. It is an echo from another reality. It is an out-of-place artifact, an oop art. To understand how profound a discovery like this would be, we need to look at the most famous and undisputed oop art in history, the Antikythera mechanism. This is not a fringe theory. This is a solid historical fact that continues to stun researchers to this day. In 1901, sponge divers discovered an ancient Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. Among the statues and amphorae, they recovered a lump of corroded bronze. For decades, it sat in a museum, largely ignored. But as scientific imaging improved, researchers began to look inside the lump. What they found was staggering. It was a machine of breathtaking complexity, an astronomical computer containing at least 37 interlocking bronze gears. It was an intricate clockwork model of the cosmos, capable of predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and visible planets, and even the timing of solar and lunar eclipses for decades into the future. It was, in essence, a sophisticated analog computer. The most shocking part? It was dated to the 2nd century BC. Its level of miniaturization and mechanical genius would not be seen again on Earth for at least another 1,500 years. With the great astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe, the Antikythera mechanism is tangible proof that our ancestors possessed a far higher level of scientific and mechanical knowledge than we ever thought possible. It proves that the story of linear technological progress is a fiction. It proves that a great deal of knowledge was well and truly lost during the ensuing centuries. It is the ghost of a forgotten technological world. If a machine this complex existed before the fall of Rome, it forces us to ask, what other technologies existed alongside it? And could fragments of that knowledge have survived into the supposed Dark Ages, only to be buried, misunderstood, or suppressed? This is where the archaeological record gets messy and fascinating. Let's look at the Vikings. We think of them as brutal raiders with simple axes, but some of their warriors wielded swords of a quality that was, frankly, impossible. I'm talking about the legendary Ulfberht swords, dating from the 9th to the 11th centuries. Metallurgical analysis of these blades has shown they were made from crucible steel, a metal with such a high carbon content and so few impurities that it was incredibly strong, yet flexible. This was miracle steel. European blacksmiths would not be able to consistently forge metal of this quality for another 800 years. It was a piece of high technology in an age of crude iron. The mainstream theory is that the Vikings acquired the raw steel ingots via their trade routes down the Volga River from advanced steelmakers in Persia or Central Asia. But the alternative theory is more tantalizing. What if this wasn't an import, but a holdover, a secret technique preserved by a few master smiths, a legacy of a forgotten European steelmaking science? Consider another piece of lost tech, Byzantine fire. For centuries, the navy of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of the Roman world, possessed a terrifying weapon. It was an incendiary liquid, a kind of ancient napalm, that could be sprayed from siphon-like devices onto enemy ships. It would ignite on contact, it could burn on water, and it was said to be almost impossible to extinguish with water. The formula was a state secret, guarded more closely than any other. It was so well guarded, in fact, that the knowledge was eventually lost forever. We still don't know the exact recipe. This was a sophisticated chemical weapon, existing right in the heart of the Dark Ages, a technology that demonstrates a deep, practical knowledge of chemistry. It's like finding out that a medieval kingdom had a secret recipe for something akin to rocket fuel, a recipe that has since vanished. The conventional narrative dismisses these as exceptions that prove the rule. The Ulfbert swords were imports. The Byzantine fire was a one-off secret. Any lingering Roman technology, like the remnants of underfloor heating systems found in a few isolated monasteries, were just the last dying embers of a forgotten fire. But what if they aren't exceptions? What if they are the tips of a mostly submerged iceberg? This is where the story of suppression re-emerges. Imagine you, our local archaeologist, present your discovery of the 8th century gears to a panel of senior academics. The reaction is not excitement, but a kind of weary skepticism. They will find a way to explain it away, to make it fit the established narrative. The gears must have fallen from a higher, later soil layer, they'll say. It's contamination from a 14th century clock, or it must have been a unique novelty item, a gift from a traveler from the far more advanced Byzantine or Islamic worlds. It tells us nothing about local technological capacity. The artifact is neutralized. It is relabeled from paradigm shifting to curiosity. Now, add the layer of Vatican influence. The Church was the dominant intellectual force for this entire period. The narrative it promoted was one of salvation. The pagan Roman world was a world of sin and error. After its fall, humanity was lost in darkness. The Church, with its monasteries and its faith, was the sole candle in that darkness, preserving the light until the world was ready for it again. A story of a technologically advanced pre-Christian or non-Christian past doesn't fit that narrative. Sophisticated machines and chemical sciences in the hands of pagans or heretics complicates the story. It suggests there are other paths to knowledge, other sources of power. So, when the foundations of a new church are being dug, and the workers unearth a strange, complex metal object from a pagan temple that once stood on the site, what happens? The local bishop might declare it a demonic trinket, a pagan idol, and have it melted down to be recast as a proper Christian bell. The physical evidence of a competing technological narrative is gone. It's been recycled into the new story. A perfect example of this ambiguity is the Baghdad battery. This quirky tidbit refers to terracotta pots found near Baghdad, dating from as early as 250 BC to as late as 640 AD. Inside each sealed pot was a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod. If you fill the pot with an acidic liquid, like vinegar, this arrangement produces a small but steady electric voltage. Fringe theorists have excitedly claimed these were ancient electric batteries, perhaps used for electroplating, a process of coating one metal with another using electricity. Were ancient jewelers in Baghdad using these to plate silver trinkets with a thin layer of gold? Mainstream archaeologists are highly skeptical. They suggest the pots were simply containers for sacred scrolls, and the metallic elements have been misinterpreted. But the fact remains, you have an object that looks and functions exactly like a primitive battery, sitting in a museum, officially labeled as something else. It highlights the power of interpretation. So when you find your gears in the ground, in this world of managed narratives, you're faced with a choice. You can push your anomalous finding, risk your career, and be labeled a crank. Or you can accept the official explanation, call it a probable ritual object of unknown significance, and get your paper published. It's a Sunday evening there in Vietnam, July of 2025, a time for family, for relaxing, for preparing for the week ahead, not for waging a lonely war against the entire edifice of established history. But these gears in the ground just keep turning, grinding away at the simple story we've all been told. The evidence suggests the Dark Ages were not a uniform, monolithic blanket of ignorance. They were a chaotic, messy period of profound loss, yes, but also a time where pockets of incredible knowledge survived like tenacious weeds in the cracks of a crumbling empire. The story of a simple fall, followed by a slow rebirth, is too neat, too clean. The archaeological record, if you look at its strange and inconvenient corners, is screaming that the truth is far more complex. This leads to the final, unsettling question of the night. If this knowledge, this technology, these maps, if they existed, even in fragmented form, throughout the Dark Ages, then why did the great rebirth of the Renaissance take so long to happen? Why did humanity seemingly have to reinvent the gear, rediscover the principles of chemistry, and relearn how to make crucible steel? Was this 1,000-year delay a natural process of slow recovery, or was it somehow an artificial one? So you lie there, surrounded by the quiet hum of your own modern world, the gentle whir of a fan, the distant murmur of traffic. It's a Sunday evening, July 27th, 2025, in Ho Chi Minh City, a place alive with light and energy. The sheer density of technology and knowledge you take for granted is breathtaking. But now, let's hold on to that final question from our journey through the dirt and gears of the past. If the knowledge of the ancients, their maps, their machines, their sciences, never truly vanished but was merely lost or hidden, then why the delay? Why did humanity need to spend 1,000 years in a state of apparent amnesia, only to wake up during the Renaissance and rediscover things it had already known? Was this long, dark nap a natural consequence of societal collapse? Or was it a medically induced coma? Think of it this way. Imagine a brilliant society that has mastered incredible skills. They can build structures that last for millennia, perform delicate surgeries, calculate the movements of the stars, and write profound philosophy. Then, a great catastrophe occurs. The society falls apart, and a strange amnesia sets in. For the next 1,000 years, their descendants live in the ruins of that former glory, unable to read the blueprints, unable to understand the machines. They look at a magnificent, perfectly preserved building like the Pantheon in Rome, with its colossal concrete dome, and they assume it must have been built by giants or gods, because they themselves have forgotten how to make such miraculous materials. Then, after centuries of struggle, a rebirth begins. They start finding old books, deciphering old formulas. They re-engineer the recipe for concrete. They relearn the principles of anatomy. They rediscover the philosophies of their ancestors. The world hails it as a great leap forward, a renaissance. But it wasn't a leap forward into the unknown. It was a painstaking recovery of what was known before. The real question isn't how the rebirth happened. It's why the amnesia was so total and lasted for so long. Who, if anyone, was hiding the cure? Let's look at the ghosts of this lost knowledge. Specific skills that vanished from Europe and had to be relearned from scratch. The most solid example is Roman concrete. The Romans were absolute masters of the material. Their hydraulic concrete, which could set underwater, was a technological marvel that allowed them to build the harbors, bridges, and aqueducts that were the skeleton of their empire. The recipe, often involving volcanic ash called pozzolana, was a closely guarded secret of their guilds of engineers. After the fall of the Western Empire, this knowledge evaporated. It didn't just decline, it vanished. For the next 1,000 years, the great cathedrals of Europe were built with stone and weaker lime mortars. The secret to durable, waterproof, monumental concrete construction had to be completely re-engineered during the modern era. Losing the recipe for Roman concrete is like our civilization collectively forgetting how to generate electricity. The infrastructure is all around us, but the knowledge to build or repair it is gone. Or consider medicine. You lie there, hopefully in good health, in a world of staggering medical sophistication. In the ancient world, physicians like Hippocrates and, later, Galen had developed a surprisingly modern clinical approach. They emphasized observation, diagnosis, and prognosis. Roman surgeons performed cataract removals, amputations, and even rudimentary brain surgery. They had a vast knowledge of herbal pharmacology. Much of this knowledge was preserved and even greatly advanced in the Islamic world by thinkers like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became a definitive medical textbook for centuries. But in Western Europe, medicine largely regressed. The scientific approach was replaced by a mixture of faith healing, astrology, and a crude, dogmatic interpretation of the four humors. Bleeding a patient to balance their humors became a standard treatment for almost everything. The rediscovery of the Greek and Arabic medical texts, which began trickling into Europe through translations made in Spain and Sicily starting in the 12th century, was a primary driver of the medical Renaissance. Europe was not inventing modern medicine. It was remembering it. This is a clear, mainstream historical fact. The Renaissance of the 12th century was almost entirely powered by the translation of works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and other Greek thinkers from Arabic and Greek into Latin. These texts reintroduced formal logic, scientific methodology, and advanced mathematics to a Europe that had largely lost them. The conventional story is that this was a happy accident of cultural exchange. Armies from the First Crusade came back with new ideas. Scholars traveled to the edges of Christendom and found these forgotten books. But the alternative theory asks a more pointed question. Was it really an accident? Or was it an orchestrated release? This theory suggests that the Church, particularly the vast archives of the Vatican and its associated monasteries, had held copies of many of these crucial texts all along. They had the backup drive. They were the ones who had curated the library of the past, and they chose, for centuries, to keep these specific books on a restricted shelf, hidden from view. Why hide them? To maintain absolute control. A population that has forgotten its own intellectual heritage is a blank slate. If the Church is the only source of truth, the only institution that can explain the world, its power is absolute. The rationalism of Aristotle, the materialism of Lucretius, the medical science of Galen, these things encourage independent thought and empirical observation. They create competing sources of authority. In an age of faith, they are dangerous. It's easier to lead a flock that believes the world is a simple, divinely ordered mystery than one that has the tools to start solving the mystery for itself. So why release them later? Why allow the Renaissance to happen at all? Because by the 12th century, The world was changing. Trade was increasing. Cities were growing. And the intellectual ferment from the vibrant Islamic civilization on Europe's doorstep could no longer be ignored. The dam was beginning to crack. The church had a choice: be overwhelmed by this new wave of knowledge, or get out in front of it and channel it. So they chose to manage the Renaissance. They began to sponsor the very translations they had previously discouraged. They founded the first great universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. But look at the structure of these new institutions. They were created to ensure that this new knowledge was studied and interpreted within a firm Christian framework. Aristotle was a brilliant logician, yes, but his logic would now be used to prove the existence of God, a project mastered by Thomas Aquinas. The university system became a brilliant machine for co-opting and domesticating dangerous knowledge. By releasing the ancient texts on their own terms, the church performed an astonishing pivot. They transformed their image from the gatekeepers who had locked the library to the generous patrons who were now bestowing this knowledge upon the world. It's a bit like a government that has banned a certain kind of music for decades, and then, seeing its popularity grow on the black market, decides to launch its own official radio station that plays that very music, but with government-approved commentary between the songs. Historians still argue whether the Church's founding of the first universities was a genuine effort to foster intellectual inquiry or a strategic move to co-opt and control the burgeoning academic movements of the 12th century, ensuring they remained within a theological framework. Was it an act of enlightenment or an act of supremely intelligent damage control? Whatever the motive, let's consider the cost of that 1,000-year pause. What if the intellectual fire of the ancient world had never been banked? What if the science of Archimedes, the engineering of the Romans, the medical knowledge of Galen, had been continuously built upon from the year 400 AD onward? Where would humanity be today? It's a thought experiment that is almost too vast to contemplate. The centuries we call dark were not just a period of stagnation. They represent a 1,000-year opportunity cost on a civilization-wide scale. This notion of lost practical knowledge is everywhere. Consider the quirky but real concept of Mithridatism, named for King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a fierce enemy of Rome. He was said to have made himself immune to poison by taking small, gradually increasing doses over his lifetime. Whether his specific efforts were successful is a legend, but it points to a sophisticated and experimental understanding of toxicology and pharmacology in the ancient world. It's a type of worldly, scientific knowledge that, in medieval Europe, would have been seen as sorcery, replaced by a reliance on prayers and amulets for protection against poison. As the evening deepens over Ho Chi Minh City, it's a thought to carry with you into your dreams. 1,000 years of human potential, sitting on dusty shelves in locked archives, waiting for the right political moment to be rediscovered. It suggests the darkness was a managed environment. The dawn was not an accident, it was a scheduled event. And the power to schedule the dawn is perhaps the greatest power of all. It's the power not just to control the present, but to control the rate and flow of the past into the future. It's the power of the pen stroke, the power of silence, the power of the narrative itself. We've traveled a long and winding road tonight, haven't we? We've sifted through the ashes of a fallen empire, tiptoed through silent scriptoriums, questioned the very flow of time, and examined maps and machines that seem to belong to another world. We've looked at the what, the potential forgeries, the gaps, the anomalies. But now, As we drift toward the end of our journey, it's time to look at the grand strategy, the unifying theory that ties all these threads together. The ultimate power that shaped the Western world was not forged in iron, but in ink. It was the power of the pen stroke, the subtle, devastating art of narrative control. Forget, for a moment, the image of a shadowy cabal of monks cackling as they invent a century. The truth is likely far more elegant and insidious. You don't need to force people to believe a lie if you can control the environment so that the lie becomes the most logical conclusion. You don't need a sword to the throat if you can shape the very thoughts in your opponent's head. The men who built the medieval world were architects of reality itself. They understood that if you control the story, you control everything. Let's break down this grand strategy into its core components. The three great tools of narrative warfare. The first, and perhaps most important, is the power of the filter. Reimagine yourself in that monastic scriptorium. You are a good and pious man. You have a stack of old papyrus scrolls on your left, and a precious, newly prepared sheet of vellum on your right. The scrolls contain a variety of texts, a treatise by a Stoic philosopher arguing that virtue is the only good, a risque Roman play full of slapstick and innuendo, a detailed manual on shipbuilding, and a commentary on the Gospel of John. You only have enough time and expensive ink to copy one. Which do you choose? There is no choice. It's obvious. You copy the Gospel commentary. You don't burn the other scrolls in a fit of rage. You just set them aside. They are not a priority. Over the months and years, they gather dust. The damp gets to them. Mice nibble at the edges. Perhaps a century later, another monk, needing to light a fire on a desperately cold night, grabs the now rotting scrolls because they are clearly just useless old rubbish. He isn't destroying history. He's just trying to stay warm. But the effect is the same. By consistently filtering what is worthy of preservation, you don't just save one version of the past. You actively erase all others. You create a historical record that seems to prove that people in the past were only interested in theology, because theological texts are the only ones that survived your filter. The second tool is the power of framing. If you can't make something disappear, you change what it means. You don't fight a deeply ingrained local tradition. You co-opt it. That ancient, sacred oak tree where the pagan villagers leave offerings? You don't chop it down and create resentment. You hang a cross on it and declare it the site of a miracle by St. Boniface, the pagan festival celebrating the winter solstice. You don't ban it. You move the celebration of Christ's birth to the same date and call it Christmas. The old story isn't erased. It's just absorbed into the new, bigger story. You've reframed it. The same goes for ideas. The philosophy of Aristotle, when it comes flooding back into Europe, is too powerful to ignore or suppress. So you don't. You welcome it. You declare Aristotle a brilliant man who, using reason alone, came as close as any pagan could to understanding God's truth. You commission thinkers like Thomas Aquinas to perform a magnificent intellectual synthesis, using Aristotle's logic to build unshakable proofs for Christian doctrine. You haven't censored Aristotle. You've domesticated him. You've made him a pillar of your own cathedral. The third tool, as we've seen, is the power of the delay. This may be the most brilliant of all. You don't destroy the dangerous knowledge of the ancients. That would be a crime against God's creation. You collect it. You gather up the maps, the scientific texts, the histories, and you put them in the greatest library the world has ever known. And then you lock the door. You become the dragon guarding the treasure. You wait. You let the world outside struggle, forget, decline. And then, centuries later, when the time is right, when your own power is secure and new ideas are bubbling up that threaten to challenge you, you slowly, carefully begin to unlock the door. You release the lost works of the ancients. You become the patron of a great rebirth. It's the ultimate magic trick. First, you make the beautiful dove of knowledge disappear into the black box of the Dark Ages. The audience is mystified. Then, centuries later, with a great flourish, you open the box and release the dove. The crowd goes wild. They applaud you, the magician, the bringer of light, never once questioning where the dove was all that time, or who put it in the box in the first place. This brings us to the masterstroke, the final brush stroke on the canvas of this new reality, the naming of the darkness itself. The very term, Dark Ages, is perhaps the most successful piece of negative branding in history. Now, this is a key historical fact. The term wasn't actually invented by the church to describe itself. It was coined later, in the 14th century, by the Italian scholar Petrarch, one of the first great humanists. He looked back at the centuries between the fall of Rome and his own time and saw them as a dark age of ignorance compared to the brilliant light of classical antiquity. The church didn't need to invent the term. It had spent 1,000 years creating the very conditions that made the label inevitable. By filtering out secular knowledge, by framing the past in purely theological terms, and by delaying the reintroduction of science and philosophy, they had manufactured an age that, when viewed through the lens of a later, more secular time, could only be perceived as dark. And if the age was dark, then the institution that held the only candle, the institution that preserved the scriptures and maintained the light of faith, positions itself as the sole hero of the story. The narrative is a perfect, self-justifying loop. Of course, professional historians today largely reject the term Dark Ages as an oversimplification. They point to the vibrant cultures of the Carolingians or the Anglo-Saxons, the intellectual life of the monasteries, the very real progress in agriculture and governance. But historians still argue whether the humanists of the Renaissance viewed the preceding centuries with genuine contempt for their perceived ignorance, or if the Dark Ages label was more of a rhetorical device used to emphasize the brilliance and novelty of their own era. Was it a real diagnosis, or was it a marketing slogan for the new age? In the end, the most profound power was the power of silence. The books that were not copied, the questions that were not asked, the technologies that were not pursued, the histories that were not written. There is a legendary story about the Sibylline books of ancient Rome, a collection of prophecies the state consulted in times of great crisis. The legend says a prophetess offered to sell 9 books of prophecy to the last Roman king. He scoffed at the price. In response, she calmly burned 3 of the books and offered him the remaining 6 for the same high price. He laughed. She burned 3 more. Struck with a sudden sense of dread at what was being lost, the king finally bought the last 3 books for the original price of all 9. Those last precious books were themselves lost or destroyed in the 5th century AD, another casualty of the age. This story is a perfect, haunting metaphor for the knowledge of the past. What we have is a fraction of a fraction. The silence where the rest of it used to be is the true legacy of the Dark Ages. It's like being accused of eating all the evidence in a crime. The lack of proof becomes its own kind of proof. As the night has truly fallen over Ho Chi Minh City now, as the city lights paint the clouds from below, the weight of this ancient power feels strangely contemporary. We still live in a world of narrative control, of information filters and curated realities. The tools are just faster now. Algorithms and 24-hour news cycles instead of scriptoriums and papal decrees. The principle remains the same. The church didn't need a vast, complicated conspiracy with secret handshakes and coded messages. It just needed a librarian with a very strict weeding policy. It needed a storyteller with a very clear sense of who the hero ought to be. It created a world where its own authority was not only necessary, but seemed like a historical inevitability. It's the story of a civilization that had its past edited, its progress paused, and its memory selectively wiped, all by the quiet, tireless scratching of a quill on parchment. This was their masterpiece, a controlled history. But if this system of control, of filtering, framing, and delaying was so successful, so total, so long-lasting, it leads to one final, chilling question. What didn't they release? What ancient knowledge was deemed too dangerous, too paradigm-shattering, to ever be let out of the box? What secrets are still waiting in the silence behind the last locked door of the archive? And so we arrive at the end of our journey, standing at the threshold of a final, silent question. What lies behind the last locked door? What secrets, deemed too potent for the world, still rest in the cool, dark, climate-controlled air of the Vatican Apostolic Archives? We have followed the breadcrumbs of missing time, phantom popes, impossible maps, and forgotten technologies. All these trails, all these whispers of a different history, led right here to this citadel of memory, this fortress of forgotten words. Let your mind drift there now. Imagine walls lined not with stone, but with 53 miles of paper and parchment. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the weight of centuries, smelling faintly of dust and vanished forests. It is a place of profound silence, a silence that holds more stories than any library that has ever shouted its contents to the world. And while scholars can, with patience and perseverance, gain access, it is not a public library. You cannot browse. You must request a specific document, which means you must already know it exists. It is a system perfectly designed to keep its deepest secrets, because how can you ask for the book you've never been told about? So let us, in these final moments of our story, engage in a little informed speculation. Let us imagine what might lie on those shelves, based on the clues our journey has uncovered. Let's start with the most explosive possibility. The books that challenge the very foundations of the faith the archive was built to protect. We know that in the first few centuries after Christ, Christianity was a chaotic, vibrant, and diverse collection of competing beliefs. There wasn't one Christianity. There were many. The books we now call the Gnostic Gospels, discovered by a farmer in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, are proof of this. This is a mainstream historical fact. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene paint a picture of Jesus' teachings that is deeply mystical, philosophical, and prioritizes secret, personal enlightenment, gnosis, over the blind faith and hierarchical structure that would come to define the Roman Church. For centuries, these Gospels were known only through the angry polemics written against them by church fathers like Irenaeus, who declared them heresy. The Nag Hammadi discovery proved they were real. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? That was just one jar buried in the Egyptian desert. The Vatican, on the other hand, was the central repository. Is it so hard to imagine that they have more? A complete, unedited Gospel of Mary? Gospels written by other apostles that were deemed too strange, too esoteric for the final cut of the New Testament? Finding one would be like discovering the secret director's cut of a film you've seen 100 times, only to realize the version you know was edited for commercial reasons, and the director's true vision was something else entirely. And beyond that, what of other faiths? Not just the heretical branches of Christianity, but the pagan religions the Church supplanted. We know of them almost exclusively through the hostile accounts of their rivals. What if the Vatican holds the actual sacred texts of the followers of Mithras, the detailed liturgies of the Eleusinian mysteries, the collected oral traditions of the Celtic Druids, transcribed and archived by some curious monk before they were wiped out? Historians still argue whether the canon of the New Testament was finalized because the chosen 4 Gospels were the most historically authentic, or because their narratives best supported the hierarchical church structure that was developing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Having the competition's playbook would have been an invaluable asset in ensuring your own victory. Now, let's leave the Library of Lost Faiths and wander down another, equally shadowy corridor, the Library of Lost Worlds. What of the physical sciences? Could a complete blueprint for the Antikythera mechanism be resting in a scroll tube, mislabeled as Greek astrological nonsense? Could the precise chemical formula for Byzantine fire be tucked away in a Byzantine codex? A spoil of war from the sack of Constantinople? And what of the maps? We spoke of the Piri Reis map, a lonely fragment. What if the Vatican holds the full atlas it was copied from? A complete pre-Ice Age map of the world, compiled by a civilization that our history has no room for. What if there are Roman-era sea charts showing detailed trade routes not just to India, but to South America? What if there are unedited histories that tell a different story of the Dark Ages? Perhaps a papal diary that explicitly details the invention of a predecessor to fill a gap, or a chronicle that describes the miraculous appearance of a saint in a way that is clearly a close encounter with a misunderstood piece of advanced technology. This kind of speculation is fueled by more modern Vatican mysteries. Take the quirky and intense saga of the Third Secret of Fatima. It refers to prophecies given to 3 Portuguese children in 1917. The first 2 were revealed, but the third was sent to the Vatican and kept secret for decades. When it was finally revealed in the year 2000, it was interpreted by the Church as a symbolic vision foretelling the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But a fervent community of believers, known as Fatimists, insist that this was not the real secret, or at least not the full secret. They believe the true prophecy contains something far more apocalyptic, a warning so devastating the Vatican continues to suppress it. Whether they are right or not, the story serves as a powerful modern example of the Vatican's ability and willingness to hold and control information it deems too volatile for the public. If they do it in the 20th century, what wouldn't they have done in the 10th? Of course, the prosaic reality might be that those 53 miles of shelves are filled with little more than land deeds, tax records, parish disputes, and endless theological arguments over minor points of doctrine. The archives could be vast, but mundane. But that seems unlikely. An institution that has been at the center of Western civilization for 2 millennia, an institution that has outlasted every empire, an institution that built its power on the meticulous control of knowledge, simply must have secrets. The sheer gravity of its history demands it. If they ever announced an open house at the archives, you can be sure the line would be long. I'd head straight for the A section and start looking for Atlantis shipping manifests. The ultimate power the archive represents is not just the knowledge it holds, but the power to decide, the power to judge what humanity is ready to know. The archivist, in his silent, climate-controlled world, is the true gatekeeper of our past, and, by extension, our future. The Sunday evening is fading now into night over Ho Chi Minh City. The week ahead is a blank page. The enduring question our journey leaves us with is, who, ultimately, holds the pen? And so, our story comes to a close. The theories and the whispers, the secrets and the speculations, can now begin to recede, like a tide going out in the dark. The image of the vast and silent archive, with its miles of shelves, can soften and fade from the forefront of your mind, leaving behind just a quiet sense of wonder, a gentle curiosity that can be picked up again some other night. There is no need to solve these mysteries now. The purpose of the journey was not to find definitive answers, but to wander down the strange and shadowy pathways of the past, to question the solid ground of the things we think we know. Now is the time for that questioning to cease, for the mind to be still. Feel the weight of your body sinking comfortably into your bed, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet, steady anchor in the present moment. Let the complexities of history dissolve into the simple, soothing darkness behind your eyes. The night is a vast and quiet archive of its own, and in its depths, there is only rest. All the stories are told. All the questions can wait. It is time, now, for sleep.